Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to yet another episode of Rendezvous with Anza Saqib on CXO Global TV. CXO Global Forum is a knowledge sharing platform for all C levels across the globe. They're not only domain experts, but key thought leaders who have made significant contributions to the field that they're working in and have had an impact on the knowledge economy as well. And we take massive pride in this. Today, as well, we're interviewing someone with decades of experience and someone who we would consider one of the pioneers in a lot of sectors in Pakistan. Let's welcome Mr. Zouhair Khaliq. He's the co founder of Teamup Group. How are you today, Mr. Zouhair?
Very well. Thank you so much, Ansa. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Everyone has sort of seen your LinkedIn profile, and we know about your professional, achievements and developments. But for the benefit of our audience, what was your personal journey like? Where did you grow up? How did it all start? What all does one need to do to become the next Zouhair Khaliq?
Well, I think each of us has individuals and unique in that sense. But my story is that born a long time ago, 1958, I was 2 years old when my father actually moved to Saudi Arabia. Then as the United Nations advisor to the government of Saudi Arabia at the time. And he is instrumental in creating what is today known as Saudi Telecom Corporation, STC. So obviously, as young kids, with my siblings, I lived there for 2 years in Mecca and 7 years in Riyadh. So it was a long journey. A lot of schooling was done at that point in Riyadh. We came back to Pakistan in the late 60s, and my father was here for about 3 or 4 years. And he went back into what is now PTCL. In 1974, he decided to leave again, and he was offered another job in the UAE at Etisalat. Well, at the time, there was no Etisalat. He actually was instrumental in creating Etisalat then. And so at that point, I was a teenager, and there were no colleges or even schools, high schools in Abu Dhabi, Dubai. It was a desert virtually at that point in time. Very different from what you would see today. And so I was actually opted to a boarding school in the United Kingdom. So this was 1975. And so I went to do my A-levels there, and then I did my chartered accountancy. And the whole journey was 10 years worth in sort of with GCSEs and A-levels, and then my accountancy, and a year of work there as well. And in 1984, I came back to Pakistan, having qualified as an accountant, and sort of starting a whole new journey as a young accountant in Pakistan. My first job was with a company called A.F. Ferguson's, also affiliated with PricewaterhouseCoopers. One of the largest at the time, probably still is the largest. And also it was known as Pricewaterhouse Consulting, so it was a hybrid. Now, you have to know something. I qualified as an accountant, but I've always just described myself as a reluctant accountant. It wasn't what I wanted to do. But my father, my grandfather, my 5 uncles were all engineers, and I was expected to be an engineer. I was terrible at physics, mathematics, and I just couldn't do it. So the accountancy thing was kind of just to make everyone happy. I will do something which is a qualification. So when I got to Ferguson's, I was obviously offered a job as an auditor, which I did for about 7 or 8 months. But there was something missing there for me, and I saw an ad for a young accountant being hired at ICI in Pakistan, and ICI PLC at the time was probably the biggest corporate in the Pakistan corporate sector at the time. I was very fortunate. I was offered a job, and I took it up immediately, which meant moving from Islamabad to Karachi. So a whole new journey started again, and that lasted 7.5 years in Karachi, and then later in a place called Kyora, District Jhelum,
where the salt mines are.
Where the salt mines are, yeah. So this was ash business, and I spent with my very young wife at the time. We just married about a year before we moved there. We spent 3 years, or as I always say, 2 years, 11 months 7 days and 5 hours because I just couldn't
Oh,
wait to get out.
I can imagine how excruciating it must have been.
So for me, from South Kensington to Cura was quite a journey. But it was the greatest learning I've ever had in my life in terms of, the company being an excellent corporate in terms of processes, systems. And I learned a heck of a lot in that time. But I was, again, something inside said, it's time to do something different. And I started to look around, and there was a young company at the time, virtually a startup called Instaphone. And this was run by an international company called Millicom. They offered me a job in Karachi. So it was an immediate out from Cura. I could get out. But also they offered me like twice the salary. And this was a whole new, very exciting technology thing that I had been dreaming of for a long time. And so I, to say, jumped at it, went and joined Instaphone. And pretty soon realized that it was a terrible mistake because the company was run very differently from ICI. It was, let's say, the ethical and moral values within the top team were just not
Right.
I would want them to be. And so I started again to look very rapidly. And at the end of 10 months, I quit, in fact, because I just couldn't bear to do what they were doing. And I was jobless for about 3 or 4 months before another mobile company who was looking for a financial officer at the time approached me through a headhunter. And after many weeks of meeting them and going through their records and everything else, I accepted the offer. The company was Motorola. And what they wanted to do was to set up something in the mobile sector in Pakistan. It was going to be the first GSM operation in this part of the world.
Mhm.
And although there was a team which had worked on it before me, and there were local shareholders who had done a lot of work on it, when the company got incorporated, and the first official employee on the payroll was myself. So employee one at a company which would then become known as Mobilink. And that was a fantastic journey because, again, it was a startup. I literally worked out of the spare room in my home in Karachi. There were obviously, limited resources. We went through a heck of a lot in terms of negotiating bank loans, getting on board things like auditors and lawyers and a whole team. And it was a very, very interesting, very exciting time for me because every day was a learning in terms of the technology, but also in terms of creating a whole new world, a whole new company. And it's probably the most exciting time I've had in various parts of my career. And that, evolved into what we know as Mobilink. And I moved from Karachi then to Lahore for a couple of years, and eventually back to Islamabad. And 3.5 years into the program, I again got a little itchy, and I wanted to do something a bit more. And Motorola then offered me, basically, they were very happy with what I'd been doing, and they offered me a choice: go to Hong Kong or Florida or London. And in hindsight, I chose London because that's, for me, was familiar. But a lot of people keep saying to me, why did you not choose Florida, for example, where the sun is always shining and so on? But for me, London was home ground. It was familiar. It was like going back to my former home. So I moved with my wife and my 2 very young children at the time, my son and my daughter. And I became head of what was known as Motorola Europe, Middle East, Africa. I had headed up the operations section of this. And so my life was about travel. It was 3 weeks on the road, getting on a plane, flying to Jordan, to Lithuania, to Pakistan.
A lot of globe-trotting then. A lot of globe-trotting.
A lot of globe-trotting, a lot of air miles. And, it was, again, an amazing learning because I was interacting with the CEOs and the C-level teams of all the various companies that we had a share in as Motorola. And again, at the time, it was just a lot of hard work and a lot of traveling and a lot of sleepless nights. But in hindsight, when I look back on this again, this was my academy for how to run a company and how to be a CEO, something they will not teach you at business school. And I did that for 6.5 years. And at which point, as all good things, the whole Motorola journey was coming to an end because the division, the group that I was working in within Motorola was being wound up. And we were actually in the end forced to do a fire sale of all the properties, as we call them. So the company shares in Egypt, in Jordan, in Pakistan, in Lithuania, and other countries were then up for sale. And I guess I got lucky again, very lucky, because one of the people I used to work with was our partners in Egypt, called Orascom Telecom. And the founder, chairman, and CEO of Orascom Telecom, a gentleman called Sawiris, came back and offered me a job. And he said, come and work for me in Egypt. I didn't take the job immediately because I was then still stuck between trying to get my UK nationality at the time. I was about 8 or 10 months away. So I explained this to him, and he said, fair enough. I got a job with another very young company called W Cities. It was a fantastic company at the time, which had amazing ideas, young founder, and I was brought in as the gray hair at the age of 40. And I was chief operating officer. We were supposed to build this company to the next stage. The product it has, if you look back again, would basically be described as Google and Google Maps. So what you could do, search for your favorite restaurant, your favorite museum, anywhere in the world, and read a review about it. And then as we added on to that, you could actually then say, take me there. And it would give you a map downloaded onto your phone to take you there, which is Google Maps today, right?
Right, absolutely.
2001, there was no 3G. The technology called WAP, PRS, which was a half G, came in a bit later. And the company basically failed completely, went bankrupt. Founder and everybody flew off. I was the CFO, chief operating officer, sorry. And I was left to wind things up. I hadn't been paid in 6 months. I was completely broke. I had no idea where I was going to go here. And I didn't know whether I could pay the school fee for my kids the next month or the mortgage on. And a very tough time. But, you know, God is kind, he's benevolent. And Naguib from Egypt called again. He said, come and join me. And so I flew to Cairo, took that job as the sort of the chief financial officer for the group of Orascom Telecom. And they were going bankrupt because they had a huge debt and they weren't able to service it. So my biggest job was then to kind of renegotiate all the loans across the world, something like $1.6 billion worth. And that took the best part of about 7 or 8 months, where we ended up selling some of the properties that Orascom Telecom had at the time in Yemen and Syria, Jordan, Africa, and refocused everything on, by that time, a company called Mobilink in Pakistan, Fastlink in Jordan, because the Motorola share had been sold to Orascom earlier. By myself, as it happened, I was instrumental in making those sales at Motorola earlier. And I spent a year in Cairo, basically moving from being group CFO to group chief operating officer. And we set up companies in Syria, in Tunisia, we set up Egypt. We also started looking at other companies at the time in Iraq, for example, just before the 2003 invasion of Iraq. We had a company in place because we anticipated what would happen. And we actually built for it a year before the Iraqi government in 2004 actually allowed a license to be issued. So that was, again, a wonderful experience, always living, as I say, by the seat of your pants, again, flying through the region and making sure that everything was going fine. At which point my boss approached me and said, I would like you now to go back to Mobilink and become the CEO. And that journey started June 2003. And again, I landed here. And for those who don't know, there was a notice which had been served by the Telecom Authority, which says you have 30 days, Ashok, notice 30 days before we shut down the company for bad and poor performance. And that's when I took over as CEO. So
And you
it was a lot.
turned the company around.
Then it was a story of how you can turn something
Yeah,
around. And it was
absolutely.
all those years of learnings from all those travels to all those different countries, which came in extremely useful. It was like a Bible or a guidebook in your head, which gave you, for every instance, hey, this is how we should do it. And
And
that
that
was a
is why
fantastic.
experience matters so much, right? And speaking of experience, Zouhair Sahib, I'd like to ask you that since you've seen the whole, I would say, evolution of the telecom and cellular sector in Pakistan,
Well, not only in Pakistan, but
yeah,
actually around the world,
I
because
know.
Motorola
Of
used to
course.
sell those phones about this big with an antenna even bigger on top.
Yeah, well, we've only seen them in photos, but
Yeah.
I can imagine what a mission it must have been to use them. But how do you see the journey of Pakistan? Do you think we are at par with the rest of the world as we stand today?
We look. There's differing opinions about it. I have my own. Let's look at the numbers first and the landscape.
Hmm.
Today, we have something like 183 million
Million.
mobile connections in Pakistan. Now, some of them are double counted because some people have 2 or 3 connections at the same time. But let's say about 120 to 125 million are unique connections. So we are saying more than half of Pakistan has a mobile connection today. A PTA report for 2019-20 says that 98% of households in Pakistan are connected through a mobile phone. Now, that's an amazing figure to look at. And something like 100 million of those connections are 3G, 4G broadband connections. So
Hmm.
again, that's a very impressive number. I think what is slightly behind is the quality of what that is, and also specifically the what we would call data speed in rural areas. So although it is termed broadband, it's probably not even 3G, it's sometimes 2.5G.
Right.
GPRS sort of. And remember, if you cast back to 10 years ago, or even 6 or 7 years ago, data speeds were very different from what they are today. When you look at 4G and compare it with what would have happened in 2.5G, there's it's miles apart. And I think that's part of what is missing. But overall, if you look at Pakistan, it's a digitally connected society today.
Do you really think that way? Because as I see it, there's also this very big digital divide. There's internet inequality, like you mentioned. For most rural areas, whether you talk about rural Sindh, rural Punjab, I mean, I'm not even going up the mountains,
Yeah.
but a lot of villages still have connectivity issues, which shouldn't be the case in
Yeah,
2021.
absolutely. And as I mentioned, Anza, the issue is that although they have connection, they may have coverage. Part of it is the data speeds, which is the real problem, and sometimes even the actual quality of the coverage. Yes, I mean, if you drive down the motorway, it works most of the time, but you
Yeah,
take a left or a right off the motorway, and suddenly you feel
absolutely.
you're like, in a different world. So yes, that is absolutely true. And there are lots of reasons for that. We could, if you want, we can go into them. But yeah, yes, it is something that is a hue and cry at the moment at all levels. A lot of people discuss it every day, from whether it's the regulator or the operators or the policymakers. And it is something that we need to address, and urgently, because I think otherwise we as Pakistan will be left a little bit behind the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Now, I also know that you have been instrumental in the whole startup ecosystem in Pakistan. I know that because I know about the kind of work that you're doing. But for the knowledge of our audience, how did you get involved in the ecosystem? And where do you think Pakistani startups are lacking in terms of the pitches that they make? Because I'm sure you hear a
Yeah.
hundred a day.
So look, I mean, the startup ecosystem has been around in Pakistan for maybe 6 or 7 years. So there were some early incubation centers set up privately or through private sector efforts. My journey started kind of in 2014 when I was heading up something called the Mobile for Development division at the GSM Association for about a year and a little bit. And my job was to basically fund technology startups around the globe, actually, between Africa and Latin America, Asia as well, where we would pick technology which would eventually work over the mobile phone. And needless to say, those, the buzzwords of agri-tech and fintech and e-education and all of that were the kind of things that we invested in. Now, I stayed there for about a year and a half, and I left for various complicated reasons, which is too long a story. But the bug in me had been kind of been awakened, if you will, where I realized that this is a whole new area that one needs to focus on. And my partner in crime, as we call him, my partner called Pervez Abbasi, who's also a veteran. Again, we met in 1992. Instaphone, and he was in sales and I was heading finance, and then the journey through Instaphone, through Mobilink, and this came to where we are in sort of late 2015. We were having a coffee in London, and we said, God's kind to us. We've done a heck of a lot of very interesting things. It's time to back somehow. Discussion led to saying, let's go and do some incubation for Pakistani startups and the basics of build a business, how to product to market, and how to make it successful. Believing that between us we had some necessary skills and experience to be able to do that. And as I say, the universe smiles on you, and at the same time the government of Pakistan, through the Ministry of IT and Telecom, were looking at setting up an incubation center. The funding was to come from the Ignite Technology Fund. There was an RFP put out for this exercise, and we were one of the people who bid for it. Our little company called Teamup was young and very a startup itself. But what we did was we partnered with our old company, Mobilink, now known as Jazz. And we bid for this, and to our utter surprise and shock, we actually won the bid. And that started the journey of the National Incubation Center and our efforts to groom and develop startups in the Pakistani ecosystem. The NIC, after a year and a half of its performance, was recognized as a great success by the government. And then they went out and funded 4 more, one each in the provinces, one in Karachi, one in Lahore, Quetta, and Peshawar. So that's how the ecosystem grew very rapidly in that time frame. Now, coming to your other question of Pakistani startups and their pitching abilities. Now, look, pitching for something anywhere in the world is a very difficult business. It's basically you could tell a story for a long time, but typically these are called elevator pitches. Something you're going to do in like a 2 or 3 minute frame, and you've got to do it very quickly. Now, this is not an essential skill that people learn at college or school, and often not anywhere else. And so it is part of the issue. The other part of the issue is that a lot of our startups have not really been exposed to the wider world. So they've grown up in a particular city or in a particular region, and I guess their focus is only those areas, and their understanding may be a little bit limited. I'm not trying to downgrade or denigrate any of our very, very bright startups, because they have some fantastic ideas, some amazing products that they have tried to bring to market and are bringing to market. But pitching can be a skill. It is very much a skill, and it's something that we teach at our National Incubation Center, Pakistan. And I personally take part in the pitching sessions, as do a whole lot of other people from across Pakistan and even internationally. And it is a skill that needs to be constantly and refined. And I think if you look at the results, if you will, if you allow me for a minute, the last year and a half have been fantastic in terms of our startup ecosystem, because if you asked me 3 years ago, there was not a single venture capital in Pakistan. And yet, there were a few angel investors and so on. But now there are 20 plus venture capital firms in Pakistan. They are seeing the potential of Pakistan and Pakistani startups and where they can go with this. More importantly, if you look at the numbers, in 2020, year of COVID, Pakistan received $77 million of VC funding. Now, it doesn't seem like a very big number, but if you compare it with the year before, it's 27% up. Okay. If you look at 2021, and we haven't even yet hit first half, that number is now at over 105 million, with at least another 20 million that I know of in the pipeline, which has not been announced. And that will happen before the half year is over. So if you then look at the full year, you're probably looking at something around 200 million, inshallah. So coming back to the reason I wanted to say this is because, yes, they may be a little bad at pitching, but guess what? The rest of the world is listening and is willing to fund them. So more power to our startups, and kudos to the ecosystem which is developing to support them right now.
Right. Now, another issue that happens, so when they make sometimes some of our startups, and I've seen this happen in some of the ones that I've personally interacted with as well, they're very good at making their elevator pitches, but then they say that ideas are a dime and a dozen. It's how you execute them that matters. And I've seen that usually at an infancy state, startups often just give up, or they either run out of funds. So, is there any piece of advice that you like to concisely, any piece of advice that you have for our startups that are watching?
So the entrepreneurial ecosystem, whether in Pakistan or anywhere else in the world, is a tough one. It's not like going and doing a job on a daily basis, because everything is paid for, and you turn up, the boundaries are defined, and you have a job description and you do it. In a startup, everything is up for grabs. Okay, so everything from your own knowledge of what to do, the ability to do it, and then obviously things like funding, support from the ecosystem, legal advice, professional advice, banking, managing your finances. Everything is really a challenge. Now, I've seen both sorts of stories happening. There are those people who are pure technology and have just left college, and they've come to a startup because they have a great idea. Now, the odds of that succeeding pile up very rapidly, because those people do not have the let's say the experience or the skill set to address all of these other issues that I've described. Then you have those kind of startups who've worked, let's say the founders have worked for, let's say, 5 to 7 years in a corporate or in another business, and have therefore had the opportunity to learn some of this stuff. And their startups invariably fare better. And because they're obviously by that time a little bit more mature as well. And that happens too. But going back to the fundamental issue, the rate of startup success, even in Silicon Valley, is about 2 to 3%. Okay, everybody else you don't hear about. The ones you hear about are the great success stories. Nobody talks about all the guys who had to go back to the drawing board, either gave up or restarted with a different idea, we call in the lingo a pivot, and so on. So that is a constant, not only for Pakistan or anywhere else. Failure rates are high. My only advice, never give up, because if you have a good idea and you know that you believe in it and you think it will work, then keep trying, because eventually it will happen. But it's not easy. It's not for everybody. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's only for the believers.
Right. Those are very encouraging words at the end of the day. Mr. Zouhair Khaliq, I also have another important question. So you have spoken about being a mentor or a guide for many people. Have you had a mentor without whom the journey would not have been possible?
I would say many, some very, very influential people in my life who have been responsible for a lot of the things that I've learned over the years. And those lessons have stayed with me. And there were people at ICI when I started. Particularly, I would want to mention somebody like a gentleman called Munawar Hamid, um, uh, our chairman at the time, Naseem Mirza. There was a gentleman called Sanallah Qureshi. These were people who had tremendous influence on my life in the way I observed what they did, I observed how they worked, and often, asked them for help. There was another very dear gentleman called Azhar Ali Malik, who was also a boss of mine at the time. These people had tremendous skill sets, tremendous patience, and a huge focus on how things should be done. And they were amazing people in their own rights, and they had a great influence on me. Later, when I was at Motorola, there were people like Craig Thompson, who was my boss in London, and there were people like Dick Asink and others, and Bill Lockman in the US, who, again, I had great respect for. They taught me such a lot of things over the years. Today, as I look back on all of this, and I look at, for example, my partner, Pervez Abbasi, again, I mean, I've learned things from him that I probably would not learn at any business school at all. It's just the way he thinks and addresses things, which is a great learning for me as well. So I could go on and on.
Any particular piece of advice that still resonates with you, like on a regular basis?
So one of the things that's always stayed with me is with Munawar, when I worked with him directly for about those 3 years or so. After the morning meetings and the huddle and everything else, if you walked into his office after 2 p.m. in the afternoon, he would be sitting there with the desk absolutely clean, a notepad, a pen, and his spectacles with him. And he'd be staring at the front wall. And I asked him one day, I said, what is it that you do? And he said, well, you guys are all going to do what you do after the meetings we've had and fight the fires on a daily basis. My job now is to look ahead and look ahead next week, next month, and the next 10 years. And I was completely floored. And that stayed with me because that is how business is run. It's not about tomorrow or day after or the next hour. It's about having the vision to plan for those 5 years and those 10 years. Because if you don't know the roadmap, you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there. So that, to me, is one of the most wonderful pieces of advice. The other one came from Craig Thompson when every year after Christmas in London, on the 27th of December, he would insist on coming in for the day. And with his assistant, he would say, Carol, I am on holiday from this date to this date in March, summer holiday in June, and he described the dates. And then I'm on a sabbatical between, like, on around Christmas. And now we can fit the rest of the calendar, he would say. Let's fit in all the meetings. It may sound a little incongruent. The lesson here is you need to balance your life, and you need to put in your in the middle, put them as stakes in the ground, and then work everything around it. Because if you just do work all along, you're going to basically kill yourself too early. So those two, I think, are the most essential ones. Again, there's obviously so many lessons one learns in life, but I would describe those two as important ones.
Absolutely remarkable, these two lessons, because I can see why you have reached where you are at right now. What about your personal time? What do you like doing when you're not working and not planning the future ahead? I can see books in the background, so I'm assuming that's one of the hobbies.
So this is something that my family laughs at often enough. They say, well, if you want to see Zouhair, kick back, then basically he sits back, you read a book, put on some nice jazz music, smoke a cigar until the next conference call comes around.
Okay. No, that's lovely to know so much about you today, Mr. Zouhair Khaliq. Thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, we're running towards the end of the session today. But on an ending note, I would like to ask you, what do you think is the utility of forums like the CXO Global?
Well, I think, look, it's an opportunity for people to discuss issues, to discuss them on a forum which is, well respected and well attended most of the time. It's an opportunity to be able to learn from your colleagues, your friends, people that have made a mark in their careers. I think all of that is very valuable. Again, these are things that are not taught in business school often, or they don't come in books. And I think that's a very valuable lesson in today's world, especially exploiting the kind of technology that we are doing right now. And it's a short, quick, course in trying to learn things which are essential for building businesses and careers.
Great. Thank you very much for your time. And
Thank
we
you.
wish you all the best. And we hope to hear more from you in the future.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your
Thank
time.
you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. That's it for today. Please keep us updated with your comments and feedback. If you want to learn more about Mr. Zouhair Khaliq, we've shared some links in the description below. Or if you can't find those, please get in touch with us and we'll get you in touch. That's it for today. I'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.